The faint wail of a girl's voice echoed through the empty halls of the Golden Sit Church, piercing the silence of the night. Pastor Adigun froze mid-step, his breath caught in his throat. The sound was faint but unmistakable, an anguished cry laced with pain and accusation. His palms began to sweat as he turned toward the source, only to find the shadows of the room shifting unnaturally. "Adigun!" The whisper came again, soft yet bone-chilling, as if carried by the wind itself. It was the voice of a girl, her tone sharp enough to slice through his sanity. His heart pounded violently, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a boulder. He wanted to run, to escape the nightmare clawing at his reality, but his feet were rooted to the ground. And then, in the dim glow of the flickering candles, her figure appeared, pale, blood-stained, and unblinking. It was her, the one he thought he had erased, the one he had sacrificed. "Did you think I'd stay silent, Pastor?" she whispered, her lips curling into a ghostly smirk. The weight of her presence suffocated him as he stumbled back, his mind racing. He had made a deal with the devil for wealth, power, and recognition. But now the price of his greed stood before him, demanding retribution. Pastor Adigun had always been a man of faith. For years he labored tirelessly in his small church, the Golden Seat Ministries, located in a remote part of Lagos. Despite his efforts, the church remained a shadow of what he had imagined. His sermons echoed through mostly empty seats, and his life was plagued by poverty. Late at night, he would kneel on the cold, cracked tiles of the church floor, pleading with God for a breakthrough. But weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, and nothing changed. Adigun's passion for ministry had been unshakable at first. He believed wholeheartedly in his calling, confident that God would honor his dedication and provide for his needs. He poured everything he had into the Golden Sit, his time, his resources, even his health. But the harsh realities of life had begun to chip away at his resolve. The small congregation that once gathered with hope and enthusiasm had reduced. Some left because they couldn't see any tangible blessings in their lives. Others were lured away by the promises of larger, more prosperous churches in the city. The few who remained were struggling themselves, market women, unemployed youths, and elderly widows who could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone support the church. One Wednesday evening, after a midweek service attended by only 3 people, Adigun sat alone in his dimly lit office. The walls were damp from leaks in the roof, and the smell of mold hung heavy in the air. His Bible lay open on the desk in front of him, but the words seemed blurred. "God, why?" he muttered, his voice breaking. "I have served you with all my heart. I have preached your word faithfully. Why have you forsaken me?" He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out an envelope containing the church's meager earnings for the week. It was barely enough to pay the electricity bill, let alone cover his personal expenses. His stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder of the meal he had skipped that day. Adigun's journey into ministry hadn't been easy. He grew up in a poor village where his family could barely afford 3 meals a day. But his faith had always been strong. He often told the story of how he felt called by God at the age of 16 after surviving a near-fatal accident. "I promised God that day," he would say, "that if he spared my life, I would dedicate it to his service." And so he had. Adigun went on to attend seminary, working odd jobs to pay his fees. He graduated with honors and started the Golden Sit with high hopes. He believed his obedience and hard work would be rewarded. But as the years dragged on, his faith was tested like never before. His wife, Bola, had been his pillar of support, but even she couldn't hide her frustration anymore. "Adigun, I believe in your calling," she said one night as they sat in their one-room apartment. "But how long are we going to live like this? The children are growing, and we can't even afford to send them to good schools." Adigun rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of her words. He wanted to provide for his family. He wanted to be a good husband and father. But how could he do that when the church barely brought in enough to survive? "I'm praying, Bola," he replied softly. "I'm fasting. I'm doing everything I can. God will come through for us. We just need to hold on a little longer." The final straw for Adigun came one Sunday afternoon after service. He decided to visit one of his old seminary friends, Pastor Joshua, whose ministry was thriving. As Adigun entered the massive auditorium, he couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. The church was packed with thousands of people. The choir sang with such energy that the ground seemed to vibrate, and the air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of his own church. Joshua spotted Adigun in the crowd and called him to his office after the service. "Adigun, my brother," Joshua exclaimed, embracing him warmly. "Joshua," Adigun said, managing a weak smile. "Your ministry, it's amazing. God has really blessed you." Joshua chuckled and gestured for Adigun to sit. His office was luxurious, with plush chairs, polished wooden furniture, and an impressive collection of books lining the walls. On the desk sat a framed photograph of Joshua with a prominent politician. "How's the golden sit?" Joshua asked, pouring himself a glass of orange juice. Adigun hesitated, not wanting to appear ungrateful. "It's fine. We're holding on." Joshua raised an eyebrow. "Holding on? Adigun, I know you. You're a hard worker, a faithful man of God. But sometimes, my brother, we need to ask ourselves if we're doing something wrong." "What do you mean?" Adigun asked cautiously. Joshua leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together. "I mean that maybe we're not tapping into the right resources. Ministry is hard, Adigun, but it doesn't have to be impossible. Look around you. God's blessings are abundant, but we must be wise enough to access them." Adigun frowned. He didn't fully understand what Joshua was implying, but something about the conversation made him uneasy. That night, Adigun returned to his church and knelt once again on the cold tiles. He prayed harder than he ever had before, pouring out his heart to God. "Lord, I need you," he cried. "I don't want to lose faith. Show me what to do." The hours dragged on, and as the first rays of sunlight crept through the broken windows, Adigun felt no closer to an answer. Exhausted and defeated, he lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Joshua's success, of his wife's tired eyes, of his children who deserved a better life. And for the first time, a seed of doubt began to grow in his heart. What if there was another way? Adigun could not shake Joshua's words from his mind. We must be wise enough to access the blessings. What had he meant? Joshua's success was undeniable, and his life seemed so far removed from the struggle Adigun faced daily. Days turned into weeks, but Adigun couldn't let the conversation go. As he prepared his sermons or prayed with the congregation, a small voice whispered in his mind, "What are you missing?" One Friday evening, after a particularly disheartening prayer session, Adigun decided to visit Joshua again. The weight of his burdens made him desperate for answers. When he arrived at Joshua's office, his friend greeted him warmly, though a knowing glint flickered in his eyes. "Adigun, my brother." "Back so soon?" Joshua asked, gesturing for him to sit. Adigun hesitated. "Joshua, I need to understand. The last time we spoke, you mentioned being wise enough to access blessings. What did you mean by that?" Joshua leaned forward, his expression serious. "Adigun, we've known each other for years. I know your heart is pure, and I know how hard you've worked. But ministry is not just about hard work. It's about results. People won't follow a pastor who struggles like the rest of them. They want to see power. Miracles." Adigun frowned. "I know that, but God's timing." Joshua cut him off with a wave of his hand. "God's timing, yes. But Adigun, what if I told you there's a way to accelerate the process, to unlock the favor you've been waiting for? Adigun's heart raced. What are you talking about? Joshua stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it and pulled out a small wooden box. From it, he retrieved an intricately carved statue of a man seated on a throne, his face obscured by a crown. "This," Joshua said, placing the statue on the desk, "is Oba Aye, the king of the earth." Adigun stared at the statue, a chill running down his spine. "What is this, Joshua? Some kind of idol?" Joshua smiled faintly. "It's more than that, my brother. Oba Aye is a gateway. He can give you everything you desire: wealth, power, influence. Many pastors you admire have connected with him. Their ministries are thriving, their lives transformed. And you could be next." Adigun stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Joshua, are you saying you've involved yourself in this? This is not of God." Joshua sighed and sat back down. "Adigun, don't be so quick to judge. Look at me. Look at what I've achieved. Do you think I could have done all this on my own? God helps those who help themselves." Adigun's hands trembled as he backed away. "This is wrong, Joshua. I can't. I won't." Joshua didn't stop him as he turned and walked out, but his parting words lingered. "Think about it, Adigun. When you're ready to stop suffering, you know where to find me." For days, Adigun wrestled with what he had seen and heard. He knew it was wrong. Everything in his spirit screamed against it. But the desperation in his heart refused to be silenced. Each morning, he would wake up hoping for a breakthrough. But the reality of his empty church and unpaid bills would crush his spirit. Bola noticed the change in him, but whenever she asked, he brushed her off with a forced smile. One night, as Adigun lay awake in bed, his thoughts drifted back to Joshua. His success, his confidence, his luxurious life. It all seemed so far removed from the struggle Adigun was enduring. The contrast gnawed at him. Adigun sat up and stared into the darkness, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Was it possible that Joshua was right? Was it possible to achieve success in ministry without waiting for what seemed like an eternity for God's intervention? He slid out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake Bola, and walked to the church next door. The air was cool, and the silence of the night felt heavier than usual. Inside, he knelt at the altar, his knees pressing against the cracked tiles. "Lord, I need you now more than ever," he whispered. "I'm at the end of my rope. Show me your power. Show me that my faith is not in vain." Adigun prayed until dawn, his cries echoing through the empty church. But no voice answered him, no divine sign appeared. Just the hollow silence he had come to dread. As the weeks stretched on, Adigun's resolve began to waver. He continued fasting and praying, pouring every ounce of his energy into the ministry. But the heavens remained silent. His congregation shrank further, his debts piled higher, and his family grew wearier of the struggle. One day, Bola confronted him. "Adigun, how long will this go on? The children need food, and the landlord has given us another warning. I love you, and I believe in your calling, but this is becoming unbearable." Her words pierced his heart, and for the first time he couldn't offer her an answer. All he could do was bow his head and mutter, "God will provide." But deep down, doubt was taking root. Late one evening, after another empty midweek service, Adigun made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. With his mind made up, he left the church and walked briskly to Joshua's estate. When he arrived, Joshua greeted him with a knowing smile. "I knew you'd be back," he said, stepping aside to let Adigun in. Adigun sat down, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "Tell me more about Oba Aye," he said, his voice low but steady. If you enjoy this story, kindly click on the like and subscribe button for part 2.